Welcome to Independent Lens. I'm your host, Stanley Tucci. Ham hocks, collard greens, and fried chicken. This sounds like a perfect Sunday meal, or a heart-clogging recipe for disaster, depending on your perspective.
The reality is that in America, there is a class-based apartheid in the food system.
For independent filmmaker Byron Hurt, soul food was a way to connect with his culture, his roots, and his father, a connoisseur of this cuisine. But when his pops faced a health crisis, Byron began to question whether this high-fat, high-calorie fare was bringing his community together or tearing it apart.
You should call it death food because it will kill you.
This is the story of food deserts and community gardens, of Black identity and health politics, and how to honor our heritage when tradition may be too tasty for our own good.
Hard giving up that fried chicken.
Soul Food Junkies. Next.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the National Endowment for the Arts, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
This is my pops, Jackie Hurt. My pops loved to eat, and he loved eating soul food. Barbecued ribs, grits and eggs, collard greens, ham hocks, cornbread, mac and cheese, black-eyed peas, sweet potato pie. You name it, he loved it. My mother, Frances Hurt, married my pops at 17 and cooked most of his meals. Like most boys, I wanted to be just like my pops. At the dinner table, I ate whatever he ate.
So I would stack up my plate with the grits and the eggs and the salt pork, and we would slice up our pork in nice little pieces and mix the grits and the eggs together and put all of the pork that we had cut up on top of the grits and the eggs, and then put it on top of our toast. That was like a typical Sunday breakfast.
Breakfast on Sunday morning was when my pops and I really connected because we were sharing food with each other and establishing a family tradition. I never questioned what we were eating or how much. Back then, I just enjoyed my mother's delicious food. My father went from being young and fit to growing nearly twice his size. I worried all the time about my pop's health. My biggest fear was that he would get sick and die at an early age. Even though he talked about making changes, he continued to eat soul food meals that were high in fat and calories. 7 years ago, my pops got sick, and even still, he refused to give up eating traditional soul food, and I just couldn't understand why. My father's difficulty giving up soul food and other unhealthy foods made me curious about Black people and our relationship to food. I wanted to know more about soul food's history, where it came from, and why it is so important to Black cultural identity. How did Southern food become soul food? Is soul food good or bad for you? Is soul food causing illness and early death in my community? These questions set me out on a national journey to find out if we are a culture of soul food junkies.
What is it about soul food that you love? I mean, what's so appealing?
The spice, the season.
Came for the fried chicken.
Now, you haven't had nothing till you have my black-eyed peas.
Soul food tastes good. Better than most white man food, that's for sure.
Soul food is a great part of our culture because it's a time of coming together. It's a time of cooking together, talking together, sitting down and consuming together.
That's why when we pray, good Lord, good meat, come on, let's eat. Hallelujah.
Soul food is a repository for our history and for our dreams, and it's this memory of comfort. And soul food represents Black. Soul food!
If you ain't get your fingers greasy, man, you ain't eat no soul food, you know.
So not only the soul food, but soul food is the soul food conversation. The conversation of people who cook soul food, who didn't have a lot of money, so therefore they fried the chicken and made the grits and made the greens and made the string beans and mac and cheese.
Soul food for me is love, and it's the main ingredient.
At home, we didn't call it soul food, we just called it dinner.
I passed the exit.
My family is from a small southern town called Milledgeville, Georgia. Food is a huge part of the culture in Georgia, especially what is now affectionately called soul food.
Ma, what is that you're doing?
I'm putting the foil around the edges of the pie crust so that when I put it in the oven, the edges won't burn.
So I have all of these beautiful memories of my mother, sister, and me preparing and cooking soul food for our trips from New York to Georgia. We would wrap the food in foil and put it in brown paper bags. Looking back, those were some of the best times for us as a family. Soul food was a big part of our journey. We bonded as we drove south eating my mother's fried chicken. My parents told us stories about what it was like growing up in the Jim Crow South. As we crossed the Mason-Dixon line and made our way into the Deep South, my father would have my sister and me close our eyes and imagine what life was like during slavery. Driving past cotton fields on both sides of the highway, I would close my eyes tightly and visualize myself picking cotton from sunup to sundown. The stories my pops told my sister and me were powerful and made me wonder about the day-to-day lives of my enslaved ancestors. I've always heard horrible stories about slave traders feeding enslaved Africans the poorest quality foods. But if this were true, then how did they manage to survive the rigors of slavery?
Slavery may have been racially based, but it was an economic proposition, and it wasn't economic to put all those people in a ship and have them die. So you had to feed them enough of what they would eat so that they would survive the voyage, and the voyage was beyond horrific.
So what the savvy slave trader did was to study his cargo and their culture. What do these people normally eat? And best he could is reproduce that in the cheapest form possible.
Basically, the enslaved might be fed corn, rice, or yams, depending on their point of origin.
I often hear black people say that slaves ate from the bottom of the barrel. When I was young, my grandfather told me stories about his grandfather eating food out of hog troughs. Were stories like this fact or fiction?
It's important to complicate the notions of soul food in the same way that it's important to complicate our notions of slavery, our notions of American history. There's so many mythologies that have accreted onto the idea of what black people were eating during the time of slavery. If one's grandfather said that his grandfather ate out of a trough in the slave pen, there may very well be a kernel of truth to that. But we're also hearing this story now from a grandfather who heard it from a grandfather. People who were being given a peck of cornmeal and a half pound of salt pork or 3 dried fish and a little bit of salt every week. How do you raise a community of women who are pregnant, who are lactating, and knee babies, and adolescents, and men and women too, who are burning 3,000 calories a day? They can't live on what I just named. They can't. So we know they didn't. So what did they eat?
Slavery wasn't a monolithic institution. It looked different in different parts of the Americas and the Caribbean. In certain parts of the Caribbean, enslaved Africans were able to grow their own food and had Sundays off. You know, it wasn't this paternalistic system like it was in the Black Belt and the Deep South.
Under some systems, they had provision grounds, and in the provision grounds, they were expected to grow their food. Remember, slaves were responsible not only for growing their food, but in many cases for growing the food for the entire plantation.
They're giving slaves the bare minimum in order for them to exist and to work. Now, slaves are fighting against that. They're resisting by trying to provide food for themselves. So they're using a lot of the same hunting and fishing techniques that they did in Africa. The Tidewater region, slaves there are supplementing their diet with fishing, with crabs, crab cakes, and all those kind of things.
The enslaved in the Low Country had rice in their diet. They had broken rice. The rice that wasn't able to be sold became a part of the diet.
New Orleans is a very African city with, I would say, a thin French veil. The first wave of African people were coming from the Senegambia region of West Africa to New Orleans. Something else that these people brought was okra, which gumbo is actually the West African word for okra. And so the women, when they were disembarking off of the slave ships, people were finding seeds in their hair, and they were actually okra seeds.
New Orleans is interesting because although we're in the South technically, in terms of culture, we face more even south of us, to the Caribbean. So we find we got a lot in common with those cultures. We got seafood, obviously, with all the islands. Also, the kind of beans that are the heart of our food, very much common in this area south of us, not as common in Mississippi and Virginia and other places north of us.
It's my argument that the slave quarters is influencing the big house more than the big house is influencing the slave quarters. It was black women who raised these white kids and these wealthy families. And they're feeding these kids their food. So they might make for the table some kind of special dish for this planter. But in the kitchen is where that little white boy is, and a little white girl is. And she's eating, and he's eating that food and developing that palate. So as he gets older, he said, this is the kind of food I want my family to have.
I can tell you right now, we learned all of our cooking skills from African Americans. Just have to face that fact. Soul food didn't come here from the Caucasian parts of our world. They came from Africa. Whatever household you came from in Mississippi and probably in the South, if you had soul food, you had some connection with African Americans in your family so that you learned how to cook those meals so that they taste really good.
And so what happened clearly in the South, and arguably in other parts of the United States, and even more arguably throughout the hemisphere, was that the hand of the African in the pot transformed the taste of the pot.
Black people in the South, during and after slavery, took their food and seasoned it, battered it, fried it, baked it, smoked it, and canned it. With a pinch of this and a pinch of that, we turned survival food into a delicacy that people from all walks of life enjoy eating. But to further understand my pop's deep love for soul food, I decided to go back to the Deep South, Jackson, Mississippi. I wanted to get a better sense of just how entrenched the soul food tradition is to Southerners. While there, I went to an historically black college football game at Jackson State University. Here, there were thousands of black people having a great time. And where there are thousands of black people at a social event, there's got to be some soul food. Everybody. As a Northerner returning to my Southern roots, these tailgaters reminded me that there's nothing quite like Southern hospitality. The atmosphere felt like a family reunion.
How long y'all been out here tailgating?
Oh man, we got out here yesterday. What time? About 3.
Wait, y'all been out here since yesterday?
Yeah.
Everywhere I turned, people offered me something to eat. Now, I don't know about you, but growing up, my father warned my sister and me to always accept a plate of food when we came down south, even if we weren't hungry. He said folks in the South would be offended if you didn't accept their food. I ran into these brothers, who introduced me to their tailgate special.
So tell me what you got inside the junk pot.
Corn, neck bone, turkey neck.
And what else?
Potato ears.
Pig ears.
And pig feet.
And pig feet.
Yeah.
All right.
Everything ain't good for you in here.
All right, so wait, you said everything in here ain't good for you.
It's good to you, though. Good to you.
And then they offered me something to eat.
Good.
It was like my father was right there with me, standing on my shoulder. I really didn't want to reject their Southern hospitality, but I stopped eating pork and red meat years ago. And when I looked into that junk pot and saw that food swimming in all of those pig ears and pig feet, I was like, yo, y'all are bugging. But the social pressure got the best of me. I grabbed a piece of corn, hoping they'd be satisfied. But my man right here wasn't having it.
No, get your chicken. It's all good. I'm good. Get your chicken, man. Hold up, man. Hold up. You got to have it right here. Hey, you got to have it. I'm good.
Taste it.
Taste it. You gotta taste it in front of them. I'm gonna taste it right now. There you go, Doc. That's it. It ain't right. Tell the people it ain't right.
Yo, I cannot front. That turkey neck drenched in pork juice was delicious.
I think it truly stems from Southern hospitality and back in the day in the South where everyone used to feed each other. If Big Mama had this much food, everybody on the block was eating.
I mean, they don't think about high blood pressure or anything that's